Hello everyone, and welcome to a buying guide on the Nintendo Game Boy. Which model should you get if you only want to have one in your home? Of course, if you want to collect, just get one of each and skip this video, but if you only want one, watch this till the end. We of course start with the very first one from 1989. It has two buttons, start and select, and a D-pad. One speaker and a black and white screen, which is actually green and black to save costs. On the side we have a dial for volume and a connector for multiplayer. Let's turn that down. Here we have where the cartridge goes in, which is locked by this little tab when you turn the Game Boy on. When you turn it off, you can freely remove the cartridge. And here we have the batteries. It takes 4 AA batteries and lasts a few hours, I think 2 to 3 hours on just 4, so not very good. And here we have another dial for adjusting the contrast of the screen. And this is for plugging the Game Boy into a wall if you don't want to use batteries. Down here it has a headphone jack. Cartridges are these classic ones that you've probably seen before, and a bit later Nintendo began releasing the Game Boy in other colors. There is no difference between these except for the color. The original Game Boy sells for around 400 kroner in used condition with maybe a few games like this one, which has tennis and a red Game Boy for 399, 400 for a green Game Boy and Donkey Kong Land, and then a black one without any games for also 400. Then in 1996 Nintendo came with a slight upgrade to the Game Boy. It's still the same console, it's not the next generation, it's just a slight upgrade for those who want it. And it was called the Game Boy Pocket because, well, it's smaller. This one is actually my very first retro console as someone who did not grow up in the last century. It is pretty much better on every single front. It is, to me, more comfortable. It has a better screen. While the console is smaller, the screen is almost the exact same size, so you don't really miss much there. It uses less batteries and smaller batteries and gets 3 times the play hours, and it plays the same games. When you turn it on, there is not anything to stop you from taking the game out, which doesn't really hurt the console, just restart it if you've done that. On the side, as usual, we got volume and a port for playing multiplayer. We got the headphone and power port on this side, and here we have the contrast. So most of it is still the same, but it has a much clearer screen. It's not green anymore, it's more sort of grey, and much better in most regards. You would expect this one, being so much better in pretty much every regard, to be more expensive than the original, but no, it is actually quite a bit cheaper. Here we have one just like mine for 200. The only error is that it is missing the battery cover. If we pay 299, we get a green one also without battery cover, or a red one with the battery cover. Next on the list is the somewhat rare Game Boy Light. It's rare because it was only released in Japan, where Nintendo is from, so I obviously do not have one, but I found this one where you can see it usually goes for around 700 or so. The console itself, as the name would suggest, has a screen that lights up, and it is roughly the same size as the Game Boy Pocket from before. And a small fun fact for you, pretty much every single handheld Nintendo console has been the same size as the Game Boy Pocket ever since. Here's the 2011 Nintendo 3DS, a little bit taller, same thickness and about the same width also. So far every single model has been essentially the same, some better than others but still the same, and they played the same games. But in 1998, along with the Game Boy Light early in the year, there was the Game Boy Color later in the year, and this was the true successor to the original line of Game Boys. It played all the original Game Boy games, but also new ones specifically for the Game Boy Color, which are in this clear sort of shell. For a bit they also made black cartridges, which works on both but is better on Game Boy Color. Now you may wonder what happens if you plug one of these into one of the older Game Boys. You'll get a little error message like this one, which is different from game to game. These two types, the grey and the black ones, will work in both types of Game Boys. These, when plugged into a Game Boy Color, will get 4 different colors of your choosing, like this. When you turn it on, you can press any number of combinations of the buttons to choose some colors. Let's choose green. And when you use a black cartridge, you cannot choose colors because they are already chosen for you, and there is a lot more than 4. And once again you can see that they are almost the exact same size. Now let's look at some of the differences in the console itself. It has a little bump here on the back now because it uses bigger batteries. Same batteries as the original Game Boy, but only 2 batteries like the Game Boy Pocket. Some people find this little bump to make it easier to hold, more comfortable, but I personally don't like it as much. They got rid of the contrast wheel on the side because this one really doesn't need it. I have never felt like I needed one, but I have plenty of times with the older models. New is this thing. This is the same technology as in a TV remote, and you can use it by pointing 2 Game Boy Pockets towards each other like this. Then they can communicate, for example trading Pokemons in the Pokemon games. And that is pretty much it. Now, a Game Boy Color is a little bit more expensive than a Pocket, but I think it's worth it because of the extra games it has and of course the color screen. Now, if you get one in one of these 5 colors in the Game Boy Color logo, they are around 350. Take this one for example, 300 for a purple one, 375 for one in the same color, and then a yellow one for 400. Now, the Game Boy Color wasn't on the market for very long compared to the original Game Boy, because already in 2001 the successor came out. This is the original Game Boy Advance. There was a few models after this, but this is the original. It flipped the format of the Game Boys until now. Now we don't hold it like this, but sideways, and this is a lot of people's favorite Game Boy in terms of comfort. Now, with the new generation, it's of course more powerful. This is now a 32-bit system compared to both the Color and the original, which were both 8-bit. So a big upgrade there, and you even start to see a few very basic 3D games on this. The games now look like this. They are half the height from the old ones, but the old ones will still fit in there and work, and of course be in color, but these new ones will not work in any of the old ones. It uses 2 standard size batteries, just like the Color, and now it has 2 extra buttons, the L and R button up here. Otherwise, everything that was there before is still here, just in a different spot. Here's one of those 3D games I talked about. This is a Sega Rally, which is quite interesting because it's a Sega game on a Nintendo console, but it makes sense as this was around the time Sega stopped making the Dreamcast and focused on making games for other consoles instead of their own. And this is very hard to play while looking at this angle. If you play a game from one of the older 8-bit Game Boys, they will still work, but of course because of the smaller cartridges of the Game Boy Advance, it will be sticking out like this. And just like the Game Boy Color, you can choose colors by pressing a combination while the game is starting. And also at any point you can change the aspect ratio of the game with the shoulder buttons, because they don't do anything in the 8-bit games. You can have it the correct way or the wrong way. Now, the Game Boy Advance of course is a bit more expensive. Take this one for example. This is $349 for a white console without any other things, just the console. Here we have another white one for $425, still without anything, or a silver one with yellowed buttons for $475. So it is a bit more expensive, but you of course get games that are much more advanced, like this 3D game here and many others. Even if you are willing to spend this kind of money on a Game Boy, I wouldn't suggest this one, because the next one we're about to look at has 2 very nice features that none of the previous Game Boys have. Now, the next Game Boy was this one. This is the Game Boy Advance SP, and it is very different from the previous ones. And it's actually one of the few Game Boys that I don't just have one of. And not just two. I have three. And I have a problem. The Game Boy Advance SP has two different versions. Here we have one of each. This is the AGS 001 and this is the 101. And we'll get to what the difference is in a moment. First of all, of course, it opens like a clamshell and it has the standard buttons and of course these two, but now they are much smaller. And one of the best features about this is it has a standard battery just built in underneath this, so you can charge it instead of have to run around for AA's. And here it has of course the cartridge port. It plays Game Boy Advance games, and if you take any of the other ones they will still play, but they will stick out and you can still change the colors like before. On the side we have volume and on the other side we have an on-off switch. So other than the fact that it opens like this now, it is not that much different. But what's that button, you might ask? Well, that does something very nice. You see this? When I do this you can see a line of lights down here. That's because this is the first Game Boy to be released outside of Japan to have a lit up screen. And that is where the main difference comes in, because the 001 is front lit while the 101 is backlit. And here are the two side by side, and here it is compared to a modern phone. Now, because of this difference in screen brightness, any model with the 101 screen is of course gonna be more expensive, but I definitely think it's worth it. This is, in my opinion, the best Game Boy there is, at least if you want to keep them stock. But one downside they have is they have no headphone port. Apple was not the first people to do that on the iPhone. It was actually Nintendo who removed it from the Game Boy. As for prices of the 001 version, this was the cheapest one I could find right now. $425 with a charger. Here's one for $499, still a 001, but this one is customized and honestly looks amazing and comes with a USB charger. Not the original one, but I'm sure it works fine. And as for the best model, the 101, these start quite a bit higher at 900. There's also this one for 1100. That is the exact color that I have, and it has some old stickers. And the very last model of Game Boy that was ever made is this one you're seeing right now. This is the Game Boy Micro, and as the name might suggest, it is very small. It's also very rare because it was released after the Nintendo DS, if I'm not mistaken. They got rid of the ability to play the older Game Boy games, so this is only Game Boy Advance and nothing else. And the screen is supposedly slightly better than the SP 101, but of course much smaller. And they also brought the headphone jack back. And here we see the only one I could find for sale. It was $750 with one game and a charger. So to conclude the video, which model is the best if you only want one? It is by far the 101, so either that or that. But if you can't find one for a good price, then the 001 is still good, because all these others do not have any light in the screen. And all of these advanced models can of course play every Game Boy game from any model. Sometimes you can get lucky and find a seller who does not know the difference between a 001 and a 101. So you can get maybe a 101 for the price of a 001. So look closely at the listings when you're looking for one. Anyway, that was it for this episode. I hoped I cleared some things up for people who are maybe new to Game Boys, and I want to thank you for watching. See you!